The Jets' 2024 draft is probably going to be focused on offense, especially in the early rounds. But believe it or not, there are some pieces the Jets could use on defense in the draft. We'll talk about what they might be today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Friday, April 12th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Today, we're going to look at the defensive side of the ball and see what the Jets might look to add in the NFL draft. Now, I think most of us are expecting the Jets with the 10th overall pick or whatever first-round pick the Jets end up with. It's conceivable the Jets could trade up or trade down. I think most of us, though, are expecting that pick to go to the offensive side of the ball. It's just logical. If you're looking at longer-term needs for the Jets, offense stands out more than defense. The Jets made some short-term moves. They made some stopgap additions this year on the offense, but there still are not a ton of key long-term pieces on that side of the ball. In fact, if we're talking about the key positions, which are quarterback, tackle, and wide receiver, between those three spots, and those three spots make up 6 starting positions on offense. 3 receivers, 2 tackles, and 1 quarterback. Jets really only have 1 player on the team who figures to play a prominent role in 2025 and beyond. Whereas on the defensive side of the ball, you have some more core players. But I think when we get to the later rounds, I think even as early as round 3, need is not as significant because you're typically not getting an immediate starter, even in the 3rd round. So the Jets may just look to add other players, and the draft's always a longer term proposition. So you're always thinking about the future more than you're thinking about the present. And that becomes especially true the deeper we get into the NFL draft. So you might be wondering, the Jets defense looks great. What could the Jets possibly add on defense? Well, I actually do have some thoughts on this. And I think we can start on the defensive line. And the defensive line for the Jets right now on paper looks very good, especially at the defensive end position. You go 3 deep at defensive end with Jermaine Johnson, Hassan Reddick, and John Franklin Myers. I think the tackle position, though, is a spot where things are a little bit dicier. I mean, I guess maybe the Jets are banking on a Javon Kinlaw breakout season. I guess it's conceivable playing next to Quinnen Williams, but Quinnen Williams is really what makes things work at the defensive tackle spot. I mean, there are a couple different ways you can approach defensive tackle when you have a guy like a Quinnen Williams. And the Jets have kind of gone with the approach that, we got Quinnen Williams out there. He's going to draw all the double teams. He'll make life easier on everybody next to him. It's a perfectly valid way to build your roster at that position, because it worked pretty well last year. The Jets did not really have spectacular play at the defensive tackle position in 2023, but they made it work. Was Quinton Jefferson a great player? He produced pretty well. Is it because Quinton Jefferson was a great player, or because Quinnen Williams helped to get favorable matchups? I would lean towards the latter. I think Quinnen Williams just makes life easier. So I think when you're putting Quinnen Williams out there at the defensive tackle position, you can probably get good production from a lot of players in this league. But I think the Jets can improve the defensive tackle position because there's another approach you could take. It could be that Quinnen Williams is drawing so many double teams. Why don't we put somebody else out there who can draw double teams and let Quinnen get some more one-on-ones? And that's the type of thing I would like to see the Jets do in the future. Now, short on resources this year, it's going to be difficult. Maybe they get somebody in the 3rd round, though, who can be a good running mate with Quinnen Williams. ESPN has a lot of advanced stats, and one of their metrics is called pass rush win rate, which essentially means how frequently does a defensive lineman beat a block in under 2.5 seconds. At the defensive tackle position, Quinnen Williams was near the top this past year, and he was double teamed 70% of the time. So you can tell who's drawing the double teams. I think another issue the Jets face is that this is not a defense that's very multiple. The Jets don't like to throw a lot of different looks at offenses. And part of that's a philosophical thing with Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich. Their philosophy is we're just going to run the same thing over and over. And through that repetition, our guys are going to get really good at it. And this, this is another thing where there are a couple different valid approaches in the NFL. You could look to install a defense with a lot more complexity to it. But the thing you have to remember, something that's more complex to the offense is also more complex to the guys on defense who are trying to execute it. But I do think one way the Jets can be exploited is the way a smart offensive coach can manipulate where Quinnen Williams' alignment is. And that comes into like talking about where the Jets align their defensive tackles. And typically for the Jets run a lot of 4-man defensive lines. So typically one of their tackles is lined up at what's known as the 1 technique, which is kind of like between one of the centers and the guards, and the other's at the 3 technique, which is on the outside shoulder of one of the guards. So it's kind of between a guard and a tackle. Now the guy who's lined up at the 3 technique, which is between the guard and the tackle, he's usually going to get a 1-on-1 because the tackle's usually got to account for a defensive end who's outside the tackle. So essentially, and because the defensive tackle is aligned at the guard's outside shoulder, again, he's aligned in the gap between the guard and the tackle. He's not going to, the guard's not going to have a lot of help inside, and the offensive tackle is going to be taking the defensive end. So that's a way to get your pass rushers 1-on-1. The other defensive tackle usually lines up at the 1 technique, which is between a guard and a center. Now, whoever's in that spot is going to draw double teams because he's between a guard and a center. Those are the 2 guys who are going to block him. The way the Jets align their defense, or at least they have under Robert Saleh, frequently the way the guards are aligned is determined based on what's known as the strong side of the formation. And the strong side of the formation is determined by where the tight end is. If the tight end's lined up on the right side, that's the right side is the strong side of the formation. If the tight end's lined up on the left side, that's the strong side of the formation. And that determines where the two defensive tackles line up. And that, I think, makes the Jets somewhat vulnerable to smarter offensive coaches, because smarter offensive coaches can call for motions to get Quinnen Williams lined up in the double team zone. And they can figure that out. And I think that there's something to the idea. If the Jets had a really good tackle next to Quinnen Williams, he'd draw less double teams and he'd produce more. Now, again, when we're talking about building the Jets defense, is this something the Jets should use a premium resource on? Probably not. Thinking about building the roster as a whole, the Jets really do need to instill some more young talent on this offense, because we're talking about long-term pieces. We talked about the premium positions. I mean, which players do you think are going to be long-term starters for the Jets who are currently slated to be starters on this offense? I mean, I've got Garrett Wilson, I've got Breece Hall, I've got Joe Tippmann, and hopefully Elijah Vera Tucker if the health pans out. So that's 4 out of 11. So I do think when we're talking about the draft in particular, you have to skew the early pick, the 10th overall pick, towards the offense. But once we get a little bit later in the draft, if there's a player you think you could develop, if there's somebody you think can be a quality player at the defensive tackle position, somebody who maybe not this year, but maybe down the line can develop into a quality second tackle next to Quinnen Williams, that might be a guy worth looking at, because again, the way the Jets run this defense, they make themselves vulnerable to Quinnen drawing these double teams. And again, last year Quinnen was double teamed 70% of the time. He still had a good season. But he didn't produce the same sack totals, and that's the reason. He's still very productive for the role he had, but drawing all those double teams, and defenses can force them to draw those double teams. And yeah, Quentin Jefferson did okay, but you'd like to have somebody better there at the defensive tackle position. You'd like to have somebody who the Jets can really use to punish teams that double Quinnen too much. So I think looking at the defensive tackle spot, and you also have to consider that if Quinnen gets injured, that really changes the defensive tackle position a lot. Then you have a very weak spot. So you also want to add some depth at the defensive tackle position. I think you want to infuse some young talent. Now, do the Jets have the resources to do it? That might be a different question, but it's certainly something worth considering. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to some other spots. Hey, linebacker, cornerback, those are spots that look pretty good for the New York Jets, especially cornerback. Should the Jets look to add any players? Well, again, probably not at 10, but later on, it might be an idea, and I'll explain why continuing this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is the daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. I appreciate it for those of you who tune in every day. And if you do, maybe you have Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV after you watch or listen to Locked On Jets, and you probably have to turn down the volume with all that shouting. Well, then make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about areas the Jets could fill on the defensive side of the ball through the upcoming NFL draft. Now, I think we know the 10th overall pick. It would be an upset if the Jets picked defense. Now, I've been through enough Jets drafts to know that you never say never. Jets frequently do the unexpected. You don't even have to go back that far. Last year, they picked Will McDonald, which was a pick nobody thought was coming. I mean, it wasn't. I don't think we talked about Will McDonald on this show once before the NFL draft last year. So, wild things can happen. I think we can expect the Jets to pick offense, though, at 10 or, if they trade up or trade down. Wherever the Jets end up in the first round, I think we can expect them to pick offense. I think in the later rounds, though, it's less about need because the players you get are not necessarily day one contributors. So you're thinking about the future, and you're thinking about who can we develop going forward. And you look at the linebacker position, hey, it's pretty good. You have CJ Mosley, who's been to like 5 Pro Bowls in his career. You look at Quincy Williams, who was a first-team All-Pro last year. That position looks pretty good. That said, I mean, it's not a position where the Jets have a ton of youth. Quincy Williams is entering his age 28 season. CJ Mosley is entering his age 32 season. So you probably don't have longevity. Quincy would probably be around longer than CJ. And there are exceptions. There are guys like Demario Davis, former Jet, who play at a high level well into their 30s. But, those are exceptions. And I do think at some point you have to think about the future of the linebacker position. I think you also look at the corner position. Now, Jets have two young corners who are really good, Michael Carter II and Sauce Gardner. They have a corner who's very good, but also aging. DJ Reed entering his age 28 season. And, corner's a position where athleticism really matters. So you don't see a lot of corners who play well in their 30s. Again, occasionally it happens, but somebody like DJ Reed, I think, is somebody who really depends on his explosiveness because he's kind of undersized and he's a guy who plays on the outside. And if you're an undersized corner, you can play on the outside, but like everything else, if you're undersized, if you don't have size, everything else has to be really good. And for Reed in particular, again, somebody who I think really does lean on his athleticism, I'm not sure the aging curve is going to be very graceful. And even if it is, there's no guarantee the Jets are going to be able to bring him back. As we saw this year, the Jets dealt with limitations this year. And the Jets are going to continue to deal with limitations because of their cap situation. It's not a guarantee the Jets are going to be able to bring DJ Reed back a year from now. So part of what effective drafting is, it means it's not just the guys who produce as rookies, especially when you get into like round 4, round 5, round 6, round 7. You're thinking about the future. You're trying to find players who could be part of your team going forward, maybe year 2, year 3, maybe you're on the bench after they play special teams and serve as backups that first year. And that's where practice reps really come into play. It's like an underrated part of team building, but the guys who don't see the field that often, you develop them on the practice field. And these are two spots where the Jets can't really afford to use a premium resource this year. I mean, can they draft a linebacker at 10th overall? Generally speaking, that's not a good idea anyway. Can they draft a corner 10th overall? I mean, probably not. We actually had a mailbag question the other day about corner, the idea that maybe the Jets could trade down and take a corner. I did not get to that question, but I mean, I can answer it right now. I think it'd be very difficult, even in a trade down scenario, for the Jets to draft a corner when you look at their needs on offense. I think the premium resources have to go to the offensive side of the ball. That said, when we think about building for the future, the best teams are always thinking one step ahead. The best teams are balancing the now and the future. And one of the ways you balance the now and the future is you try and find players who fit your system. When we talk about round 4, round 5, round 6, round 7, the third day of the draft, even to an extent, the third round on day 2, it's about finding players who fit your scheme. In the first round, players are, generally speaking, the guys who are drafted there are going to be able to fit any scheme. They're first round picks. They're the blue chip prospects. They have skills all over the place. Their skill set is diverse. Their skill set is developed. You can plug them in practically anywhere. or into most systems. In the later rounds, the skill sets are more limited. So you need to find guys who fit what you do. Every system has certain things that ask for players at certain positions. There are schemes that ask their linebackers to, take on blocks and shed them. Robert Saleh's system is more of a run and hit type of system where they want their linebackers to be more sideline to sideline. The Jets scheme, like most of the league, very heavy in zone, but on third downs, the corners have to cover man to man. The Jets will blitz more on third down than they do first and second downs. So the Jets need to find corners that fit and linebackers who fit what they want to do. And there are certain attributes that stand out above others. I mean, if you've watched Saleh through his time with the Jets, how many times have they tried to make a safety into a linebacker? Or how many times have they just played the safety like a linebacker, like Ashton Davis, who just re-signed yesterday? Ashton Davis may be listed as a safety, but the Jets definitely played him more like a linebacker last year, and that was kind of his breakout season. They've tried it with other guys, Sherwood, where it's worked pretty well, where Sherwood actually a pretty tough team where it did not work so well. I mean, you go back all the way back to Robert Saleh's first offseason, they tried to sign Keanu Neal, longtime safety of the Atlanta Falcons, to make him into a linebacker. They want speed at the linebacker position. They want guys who can cover at the linebacker position. So it's about finding the guys who fit what you do well. And the best teams in the NFL, look, their hit rate is still pretty low on day 3 of the draft. But what do? They find players who have the attributes they're looking for. And that kind of like helps you narrow down because there's such a long list of prospects who are available to you on the third day of the draft. Every team's board is different when it comes to day 3. The first round doesn't require a lot of variety. I mean, the NFL is generally good in their scouting departments across the league at figuring out who the elite level prospects are. Once you get to later in the draft, there are prospects that may fit the Jets that would not fit Buffalo well. There are prospects that may fit the Chargers well, who would not fit the Jets well. It's really more about who fits your scheme, who's the right player for your scheme. And then after that, it's about development. Yesterday I mentioned when we talked about the offensive side of the ball, what the Jets could be looking for. I mentioned, I have skepticism about the Jets coaching staff on that, on offense. On the defensive side of the ball, I have a little bit more faith in the Jets. And you have to hit on some of these day 3 picks. I mean, you only get one first round pick a year. You have a limited amount of cap space. If you're not finding the occasional quality starter out of day 3 of the draft, it's not something the Jets have done that well under Joe Douglas. I mean, at this point, I think you could say Michael Carter II is really the only player he's found, and he's been in the draft since 2020 on day 3, who's developed into a quality starter. But you have to the Jets are going to have to start finding these guys again, especially when you look at their future, especially when you look at their cap situation. You got to find cheap contributors on day 3. And these are spots where you have to think ahead because, again, Jets are kind of aging at some of these spots, some of these starting spots. They may not be able to keep some of these guys. Some of these guys may be in decline. You're going to have to find cheap starters somewhere. And this year, when you look day 3 of the draft, that could be where it happens. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the third phase of the game because I don't think the Jets are just looking for defensive players in the draft. Of course, they're also looking for offensive players, but a hidden contributing factor to their evaluations might be, can this person help Brant Boyer special teams out? And we'll go into more detail on that, continuing this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're talking about what the Jets could be looking for in defenders in the NFL draft. And I know a lot of people think this draft will be skewed to the offense, but in reality, the Jets only have one premium pick at the moment, unless they trade down. They could trade down, or I don't know, they could make another trade and add a premium pick, but Jets only have one pick in the top 70 in this draft. So you're really looking for role players. You're looking for longer term players you can develop. And I think one area that kind of sets some of the smarter teams in the league apart from the teams that aren't quite as smart is finding contributors on special teams late in the draft. And there are teams that actually make that part of their grade when they draft players, especially when you get to the 5th, 6th, 7th rounds. They try and figure out, can this guy help us out on special teams? And that's very logical because any player you draft late in the process, any guy who's like a day 3 pick is going to have a tough time typically seeing the field. There's always an exception or two through the year, a guy like the league just completely whiffs on, who's a day 1 starter who steps right in and plays great. But the vast majority of players who drafted near the end of the draft are not going to be great players in the league. And they're certainly not going to be great players year 1. They're certainly not going to get anywhere near the starting lineup. A lot of these guys who go near the end of the draft, they're going to be like at the very back of the depth chart. The only way that they're going to get on the field is through special teams. And we have some interesting dynamics at play this year. If you haven't been following, the NFL changed its kickoff rules, which nobody really knows what the impact's going to be. I've seen some people speculate that on these new kickoffs, teams are going to use their starting defense. I'm very skeptical of that idea. I don't think it's going to change a whole lot. In fact, if anything, I think it may make the special teams aces more valuable because you're going to see more kickoff returns this year than you have in the past. But I think that the Jets are a team that definitely does value special teams in the way they put their roster together. And listen, I have a lot of criticisms of the Jets front office, and I don't think it's unfair. I don't think the Jets front office has really has really performed at a standout level since they took over back in 2019 when Joe Douglas came to town. But one thing I will praise them for is I do think they value special teams. And I think, as I mentioned yesterday, Ashton Davis was re-signed. And, I don't think they brought Ashton Davis back to be a starting safety. I think they brought him back because he handles his role well on Salah's defense. He's kind of just a part-time player. They played him a lot in very specific games against specific types of opponents. And then there are some weeks where he just didn't see much playing time, but they really value what he brings on special teams. And the Jets also lost one of their key special teamers, Justin Hardy, to the Cleveland Browns recently. So, and I know people scoff at Hardy because there aren't really a lot of statistics that encapsulate what Hardy does well. I mean, what I can tell you is he did a lot of the dirty work. You have to find special teamers though. And, special teams can make a big difference. When you talk about flipping field position, every yard you get on special teams, every return yard you pick up on a kick return, one less yard your offense needs to travel down the field. Every extra yard your coverage units pin a team back, that's an extra yard the other team's offense has to move down the field. And if the Jets win the field position battle, they're going to win a lot of games this year, in part because their defense is so good. If you give the Jets defense a short field that they have to work on and give the other team's offense a short field, Jets defense is still going to hold its own. If you force the other team to constantly march down the field against the Jets defense, that offense is going to have a heck of a hard time moving the ball effectively and putting points on the board. So, these are the types of things. I think when you talk about late round picks, it's a combination. I don't think you're drafting anybody specifically to play special teams. In fact, college special teams performance doesn't always tell you about a player's ability to effectively play special teams in the pros. But there are things you can scout on. Even guys who don't play special teams, are they smart? Are they in the right place all the time? Are they sound tacklers? Are they sound blockers? These are things you can evaluate. And that you can kind of put in your evaluation whether or not they translate to special teams. So if you're a longtime listener, if you're an everydayer, I'm a big believer in the value of special teams. It's one of those hidden things. You don't always notice it, but when a team wins a game, and when you're in a league where about half the games are decided by one score, sometimes it's easy to lose the significance of special teams. And I think it's an area where I would praise the Jets again because they have guys like Irv Charles. They have guys like Ashton Davis on their roster who fill these key roles. And they clearly consult Brant Boyer when they talk about these back of the roster spots. And special teams, when you got a guy who plays well on special teams, it essentially gives him an opportunity to develop into a player in his natural position. A guy you draft at linebacker, maybe a backup this year, a 6th round linebacker, maybe a backup this year. But if he can earn a roster spot based on his special teams performance, that gives him a chance to work on the practice field to try and develop into a starting linebacker. And sometimes that makes all the difference in the world for your team in the long run. So I think that the Jets need to at least consider it. And I think the Jets do consider special teams when we talk about their late round picks, because you're not just trying to add defenders. If a guy's a late round pick and he sees the field for your team, odds are as a rookie, he's seeing the field on special teams. And sometimes somebody can develop into a special teams ace and become an unsung hero of your roster. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.